Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
And the Ghazipur factory still exists. It's the longest lasting industrial enterprise in India. And it has produced more wealth for the British and for Americans and also for some Indians than perhaps anything else. I mean, billions and billions. A large part of London is built with the wealth that came out of this factory. And the strange thing is, it's a factory. It has absolutely Taylorite, systems of assembly and production. But the people who work there are still using 18th century methods. As you can see, everything is done by hand, and these are just poor peasants from around, from eastern UP and Bihar.
Amitav Ghosh's new book, Smoke and Ashes, A Writer's Journey Through Opium's Hidden Histories, is the story of how, under the aegis of the British Empire, India became the world's largest producer of opium between the 18th and 19th centuries, and the different conditions under which opium was produced in various regions with lasting effects for those areas. It also traces the transformative impact that the opium trade had on India, China, Britain, and the United States, with profound long-term consequences for the birth of the modern world and of contemporary globalism. Many of the world's biggest corporations got their start in the colonial opium trade. But the opium economy also had significant effects at the micro level, influencing migration and settlement patterns and touching upon millions of lives, including those of his own forefathers. This story is remarkable and revelatory because at the heart of it lies a plant, the opium poppy. While many other plants, like sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, have played major roles in history, their importance has faded over time. The opium poppy, on the other hand, has gone from strength to strength. It is now more powerful than ever, manifesting itself in the devastating opioid crises that currently grip the globe. Smoke and Ashes tells the story of how this common and deceptively humble plant has shaped the modern world and the key part it is now playing in the unmaking of that world. It is at once a travelogue, a memoir, and an excursion into history, both economic and cultural. In this episode of BIC Talks, the author Amitav Ghosh engages in a conversation with author and historian Ramachandra Guha about the making and execution of this exciting book. And now, over to Ramachandra Guha and Amitav Ghosh.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Bangalore, a city that I really love and I've been coming to for years and years. Back in those days, we used to stay at the Dasa Prakash, which I don't know if it's still around. It was a lovely hotel. But anyway, which has been really wonderful in producing this book. You'll see when you actually pick it up, it's got, the cover has a wonderful tactile sense. And I really wanted this book to be published first in India. It's one of the strange things that's happened in the whole literary world. When at the start of my writing career 40 years ago, books used to be published first somewhere in the West, and then they would come here. But in fact, those essential skills of bookmaking, cover design, but most of all of copy editing, essentially, they're lost in the West now. I mean, actually, most major publishers, they just take copy editors on contract. They don't even have in-house copy editors. And I don't think it can really work like that, because, you have freelance copy editors handling maybe like 20 books a month, and they just don't have the time. And I'm talking even about university presses, which, you would imagine that they would be better, but in fact, if anything, they're worse. So, HarperCollins has an incredible secret weapon whose name is Shatarupa Ghoshal. She's just an amazing, obsessive copy editor, that's something you want with a copy editor. So it's been wonderful to work with her and to work with Udayan. And finally, my thanks go to Ram Guha, your own homegrown, amazing Ram Guha, who I've now known for 55 years. We've been friends for 55 years. Astonishing as it may sound, because I was 1 year his senior in school. And the extraordinary thing about it is not just that, people are often in a school together without necessarily knowing each other very well. But we actually had many of the same interests then. He, of course, was mainly interested in cricket, which is not one of my interests. But we also were very much interested in history, and we worked together. I think I was 15, he was 14, on a school paper called the History Times. And, we sort of edited it, printed it, had these long conversations. So it was much more than just, sort of casually being in a school together. We really learned from each other, enriched each other. And not that we haven't disagreed. We disagree all the time about pretty much everything, I should imagine. But at the same time, there have been parallel trajectories, and it's so wonderful to have Ram here and agreeing to do this today. So thank you, Ram. So this book really begins, in a sense, with the story of tea. I should explain that the book is really about two non-human presences which have, to some very important degree, shaped not just Indian history, but the history of the modern world. And one of these is the tea plant. We like to think of chai as, it's now to us what apple pie is to Americans. But of course, chai is not Indian. Chai is, tea came from China. So here you have this, you have a picture of, tea being the circumstances in which tea is grown in China. And this is very important, especially if you look at this particular slide. What it shows us is a small peasant family, growing tea, as a sort of adjunct crop to their subsistence crops. Now, the British, when they stole the technology of tea from China, the one thing they didn't steal was this model of cultivation. Instead, they created, plantation systems which Europeans had over 3 centuries, honed, to perfection, really, in the Caribbean, in America, through cotton plantations. And, it was a model dependent on slave labor. They didn't have slave labor in India, but they had coerced labor. So, they basically handed these huge plantations to white planters, and also handed them the workers, who were basically tribals from elsewhere. And that's why the Indian tea industry now finds so much of it in disarray today, because if they would only just go back, to the smallholder model, that's how the best tea is produced to this day in China. So here you see, this painting shows you all, the entire process of producing tea from top to bottom. This is a British view of roughly the same thing. And then you have these Western merchants negotiating the price of tea in China. And then you have the British tea trade, I should explain, was the exclusive monopoly of the British East India Company. So they had a complete monopoly of it, not just in the Indian Ocean, but also in Europe, in the Atlantic. Americans, for example, weren't allowed to trade directly with China. That was completely monopolized by the British East India Company. So they would sell tea also in America, but at a huge markup, which led, as many of you will know, to the Boston Tea Party and so on. So, we in India like to think that, we were the sort of jewel in the crown, etc. But in fact, the British only became interested in India after they were driven out of the Dutch East Indies and the Spice Islands, which is a story I've told in another book called The Nutmeg's Curse. But then after that, it was really the tea trade that sustained the East India Company, but not just the East India Company. It also sustained the British government. So here, as you can see, through much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the tax on tea, which was often almost as much as 100%. So the Chinese only charged an export tax of 10%. The British tax would go up from 100 to sometimes 150%. So this tax accounted for nearly 1/10 of Britain's revenues. It earned the British government as much as all land, property, and income taxes put together. So vast was this sum that it could pay for the salaries of all government servants, for all public works and buildings, for all expenses related to law, justice, education. I mean, essentially the whole governmental structure, all of this combined. So that'll give you a sense of the degree to which the British government was dependent on the taxes from tea. And here again, you have one of these myths of modernity that somehow the Industrial Revolution was all about these very clever inventors thinking up, these clever inventions. But in fact, through this entire period, from the early 18th century onwards, the British government is really dependent on an agricultural commodity produced by poor Chinese peasants, And then they become dependent on another agricultural commodity. So that's the second part of the story. So the problem for the British was how to pay for tea. The British had to pay for tea with silver because the Chinese wouldn't accept anything else. And the silver in the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century came basically from South America. This is the great silver hill of Potosi, Bolivia. So this is a completely globalized story, as you can see. So from the 1590s onwards, and this mine in Potosi is still producing silver. But in this period, the reason that they can produce so much silver is essentially because of the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of African Americans, but most of all, the enslavement of Native Americans. So they have Quechua, lots of Quechua workers over there, and the conditions are horrific. I mean, people don't even have a sort of life expectancy of 20 years. The people who are made to do this mining. Anyway, but that brings into circulation this enormous quantity of silver. And with this silver, the British are able to pay for tea. But this becomes a problem because essentially this is the situation. Chinese exports to England are vast. British exports to China are, pretty close to nil. And in a curious way, it sort of mirrors what we see today. I mean, look at the US trade deficit with China right now, or for that matter, India's trade deficit with China. So way back then, the Chinese were already producing vast quantities of things. I'm talking about tea, but there were many other kinds of manufactured goods. For example, porcelain. That technology was proprietary technology of China. Then it was stolen again by the Europeans who started creating, their great ceramic industries. The thing is that the Europeans had nothing to export to China. The Chinese just didn't want anything that the Europeans had. We have never valued ingenious articles, nor do we have the slightest need of your country's manufacturers, said the Qianlong emperor. King George III had sent a mission to Beijing, and he just told them, go away, we don't need anything you have. The whole thing about Chinese self-sufficiency was something that really troubled Europeans. And Keith McMahon, a historian, has suggested that the British saw in the Chinese a kind of possibility of a rival master race. And this is a theme which actually goes back quite a long way because the Dutch saw the same thing. And in fact, the Dutch used Chinese settlements, in the early settlements in the Dutch East Indies, like Batavia. So a lot of the revenue farming, etc., was given over to the Chinese because the Chinese ran those organizations very well. But because of that, the Dutch often felt threatened and they would incite these riots against the Chinese populations. And there were these terrible killings. I'm talking about, going back to the 18th century onwards. And that history, as you know, has continued. So they're faced with this problem. How do we pay for our tea imports? There was one other item that the Chinese imported. They imported some cotton, and they also imported a small amount of medicinal opium. Now, opium, the use of opium amongst humans goes back to antiquity. Opium has been found in sites that are 6,000 years old. The thing about the opium poppy is that it doesn't grow naturally. It's a cultivar that was cultivated by human beings, and So humans have always had some sort of dependency on opium because this is a miraculous substance. Opium has so many uses. If you go to your pharmacy today and look through common over-the-counter medicines, you'll see many of them are actually opioids. Codeine in your cough syrup. Opiates also work very well for diarrhea. So you have opiates in, let's say, Imodium. So one way or the other, all of us have been, chomping on opium for quite a long time. And so you can imagine that if opium is still so indispensable, even now it's absolutely indispensable most of all for anesthetics. So you can imagine if it's so indispensable today, what was the case in pre-modern times where there were no synthetic medications? A small trade in medicinal opium arose very early, going back again, as I said, to antiquity. Across the Indian Ocean region, small amounts of opium were bought and sold. Traders carried them. There were these many kinds of international traders. Armenians had settlements in Tibet as early as the 13th century. So they were among the major sort of traders who were trading in these goods. In India as well, the use of opium goes back a long way, but the use of opium actually across Asia, that is basically from the Ottoman Empire to the Mughal Empire, surged after, let's say, the thing about opium is that you can think about it in a sense like an opportunistic pathogen. It lies in wait for a long time, and then suddenly when it finds the right conditions, the use explodes. So the first period in which the use of the recreational use of opium begins is under the Mongols. The Mongols were fond of using opium. You can understand why, hanging on those horses all day and night. So then you have opium being adopted by basically what are called the gunpowder empires. That is the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, and across this region, people start using opium. But the use of opium happens over 2 or 3 centuries. So there's a long period of exposure to opium. And people start using opium, but again, the line between recreational and medicinal use was very, very thin, because people would take opium, just to help them go to sleep or something. But at the very top layers of society, opium was widely used recreationally. When I say widely, I should say, amongst the absolute elites. So Babur writes about this in the Baburnama. He used to take Majun, Humayun probably died because of opium because he fell down those steps. And Jahangir was famously, he loved opium. So in this period, Rajputs also, the ruling elites of every variety adopt opium on a large scale in India for recreational uses. So there is a sort of small trade, even then, even in the 17th century, the trade in opium is very small, just like 4,000 chests of it are produced. So, just a few hundred kilograms maybe. But the main center for production was here, in this area around Patna. And Patna was the major trading center for opium. So what the British did in this period is that in the 1760s, they win these 2 big battles, Plassey and then Buxar. And Buxar basically hands them the opium-producing region around Patna. So they almost immediately, shut out the Dutch and the French, etc., who had factories for trading in opium in Patna. They shut them out. They declare a monopoly. The East India Company declares a monopoly. The monopoly is gradually tightened. And in the 1770s, they establish a large factory for opium in Ghazipur. This is where my novel, A Sea of Poppies, begins. Ghazipur, beautiful city. It has a Chehel Satoon modeled after Isfahan. It has these beautiful palaces. But Ghazipur is also where Lord Cornwallis, who was Governor General, he has a long history also in America. Butcher Cornwallis was his name. So naturally he got the Governor Generalship of India. and he came here. And he died actually in Ghazipur. That's a painting of his mausoleum by Sitaram. I'm going to show you several slides by Sitaram. I think he was the greatest Indian artist of the 19th century, but his work got lost and was only recently rediscovered. That's his tomb. So what happens is that in the 1770s, the British decided to set up 2 major opium factories. So one was in Ghazipur and the other one was in Patna. This is the plan of the Ghazipur factory, and the Ghazipur factory still exists. It's the longest lasting industrial enterprise in India. And it has produced more wealth for the British and for Americans and also for some Indians than perhaps anything else. I mean, billions and billions. A large part of London is built with the wealth that came out of this factory. And the strange thing is, it's a factory. It has absolutely Taylorite, systems of assembly and production. But the people who work there are still using 18th century methods. As you can see, everything is done by hand. And these are just poor peasants from around, from eastern UP and Bihar. So this is Sita Ram's view of the opium go down at Patna. I love this painting because you can see this guy is absolutely in love with perspective. And, if you look carefully, you'll see that Sita Ram's actually placed himself right at the bottom of the painting, in the bottom of the frame. He is painting himself, painting the Patna opium factory. And he has taken on the point of view of a bird so that he can see the curvature of the earth even. But look at it. I mean, he's actually sort of painted this opium factory to look like a Mughal palace. There are no grimy workers. There is, none of all that. It's beautiful. So the reason why Sita Ram was painting this is because Lord Moira, who later became the Marquis of Hastings, was then the Governor General. And 1815, 1816, the Marquis of Hastings went on this massive yatra, basically from Calcutta to Delhi and back, taking 10,000 people with him, most of whom were soldiers, but also painters, etc. Sita Ram went as the sort of court painter. But that's the reason why his work disappeared, because the Marquis of Hastings took it back with him to Moira, and it lay buried in his castle or palace or whatever. And it wasn't rediscovered until, I think it was the 1980s or something. And now the British Library has a large collection. So this is another of his paintings, the Opium Go Down. Again, as you can see, he's just prettied it up, made it look like a very sanitary, beautiful kind of process. By this point, the British have established this opium department, which is like a kingdom within an empire. It runs all of what we would call Purvanchal, from Bihar to eastern UP. The opium agents live in these palatial mansions. This is the French factory at Patna. No sign of it remains, I think. So the Patna opium factory was also famously drawn by a British surveyor called Captain W. Sherwill. And this is how Sherwill represents the Patna opium factory. As you can see, he is again in love with perspective. He makes the opium factory look like the Temple of Luxor. He's given it these grand dimensions. It looks so magnificent. But it's also painted by an Indian painter called Shivalal. All these painters were Kayasts from Udaipur. It's a long story, but a very interesting story. So look at the contrast between Captain Sherwill's representation and Shivalal's representation. So the reason why Sherwill made these etchings is because they were to be shown at a London exhibition. So the idea was to present India as a place where the colonial power was creating progress and industrialization and so on. So that's the intent behind his representations, which were, in that sense, intensely political. This is also Shivalal's. Again, this is Shivalal's. As you can see, Shivalal hardly represents the built environment at all. What he's interested in is the relations between people. And I think, we as Indians would immediately recognize the power of that. Here again, you see the built environment completely disappears for Shivalal. But the moment we see this, we can sense that, it's just like any other Indian sort of workshop a karkhana that you would see anywhere. There's nothing very grand or spectacular about it at all, as you saw in the earlier pictures. So this is another picture by Sita Ram. I love this picture because, you can see he's having so much fun playing with spaces and, the articulation of geometrical forms. And I think his inspiration actually comes from Giovanni Battista Piranesi, I'm sure, I feel absolutely sure that he's putting his paintings in conversation with Piranesi. Piranesi's work was hugely popular, especially among the British, so he must have seen some of them, some reproductions in the homes of some administrators or whatever. Anyway, so the opium fleet then goes from Patna and Ghazipur down to Calcutta, passing Bhagalpur, passing Murshidabad, passing Serampur, and finally they arrive at Barakpur, and then Fort William, Calcutta, and then they're offloaded, and they go into godowns where only a select few merchants are allowed to see them before they bid at the opium auctions. Ordinary people in Calcutta have no idea that all this is going on, So this is Government House. So what happens is that in a very brief period, from 1771, as you can see, the average annual opium production is tiny. I mean, not even a gram per capita for the population of India. But by 1831, 1840, it's become, it's increased just by fantastic multiples. Huge, but vast tracts of land are now producing opium for the trade with China. But that's not the only part of India where opium is being produced, because at this time, in Western India, which is then under the control of various princely states, again, their opium production takes off. It doesn't occur under a British monopoly. The British try to monopolize it, but they fail basically because of the resistance of the major Maratha states. And again, their opium production flourishes, so that between 1795 and 1840, the Chinese are facing a tsunami of opium coming from India towards them. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Amitabh, for that fascinating presentation. I was reflecting, Amitabh and I go back a very long time. As he said, and I'm not going to begin at the beginning, but I'm going to just start with a visit Amitabh made to our city 15 years ago, when the first volume of the Ibis trilogy was released, The Sea of Poppies, and I was privileged to be part of that event too. It was held in a hotel, regrettably held in a hotel because the Bangalore International Center did not exist then. And it's wonderful to see what has changed, not just in Amitabh's life and my life in these last 15 years, but how, when we are discussing a book, a work of history that emerges from a novelistic trilogy, that we have this fabulous space. And so I'd like to begin by just thanking all who made the BIC possible, and allow people like Amitabh and many others who, when they visit here, not to be confined in a hotel where many people, especially young people, are inhibited from showing their faces. Now, as I said, the book is a sequel, a non-fiction sequel to that novelistic series. It is about opium in the making of the modern world. Now, the book lies, Smoke and Ashes lies, in a distinguished tradition of histories of humanity written through the plants that human beings have cultivated and exploited. Arguably the first book in this kind of lineage was a now largely forgotten book published in 1949 by R.N. Salomon called The History and Social Influence of the Potato. All right, again, in fact, it was my teacher Dharma Kumar who first told me about that book. Then you have a book written by Amitabh's fellow anthropologist Sidney Mintz, Sweetness and Power, about sugar. More recently, you have Stephen Beckett's Global History of Cotton. Now, Amitabh says in his book that it's about a plant that is at once, I think, agent and instrument. And that's the kind of tradition that the book lies in. But of course, it's different, in part because Amitabh has both training in history and writes novels. He's also introduced elements of memoir. And as his presentation only briefly shows, it's actually not a history, but multiple histories, as the subtitle underlines. So these histories are economic, political, military, social, cultural, and even botanical. In our conversation, I hope we'll touch on some of these histories, Amitabh. But I'd first like to begin with the two countries or civilizations that are at the heart of this story, India and China. You start early on in your book by recalling that when you were growing up in Calcutta, you say, I had no interest whatsoever in Chinese history, geography, or culture, even though Calcutta has a Chinatown. You say, I had no interest in Chinese history, geography, or culture. It was by accident you discovered that though China was absent in your mental world, it was present in different ways in your material world. Now, this is, of course, yours is, of course, the typical experience of the Indian literate classes all through the 20th century. Probably every person in this room above the age of 50, shall we say. The Indian literate classes have looked to the West for influence and inspiration, but were utterly disinterested in China. Now, there was arguably one exception, who was Rabindranath Tagore. Yeah. And because he reacted intensely to China, and of course China also reacted to him. But I don't want to talk any more about Tagore because that may take the whole evening. And that will make our disagreements very visible. All right. But I want to ask you, Amitabh, is that in your travels and studies about China, your travels around China and your studies about China, did you discover a similar lack of interest in India and Indian culture, both in the past and in the present?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, the thing about it is that I remember when I went off, to study at Oxford, I had the option of studying any place I wanted. And I decided to study the Middle East, basically because I knew about, historical connections between India and that part of the Indian Ocean. But it never even occurred to me, to think about China, because China was literally an empty space in a map. I mean, I've always, we were both taught geography by a wonderful teacher. And so we always knew the places, the cities in the world and so on. But if you would ask me, even 15 years ago, where is Hangzhou? Where is Fuzhou? I wouldn't have known. I mean, it's incredible to think. I mean, Hangzhou is one of the most amazing cities in the world. Not only does it have a population of 20 million, it literally is one of the most beautiful urban spaces you will ever see. I mean, the West Lake in Hangzhou is just a miracle of urban design coming through like 2 centuries. What am I saying? 2 millennia. It's just an astonishing thing that, we are just not sort of interested. We just don't know about this. And if Calcutta has a direct flight to Kunming. It takes like 2.5 hours, almost as long as it takes to get to Delhi. But nobody, it never occurred to me until I started writing this Ibis trilogy. And then when my son was 17 and about to go off to college, we went and traveled around Yunnan, which is literally, I would say, just one of the most enchanting places you can see. It's just so beautiful. And so I think that was very much the case with our generation, that China was just blank for us.
I suppose a partial exception would be the communists.
Yeah.
Who are enchanted by China. I mean, in an abstract way, China's chairman is our chairman, but nothing more than that.
No, actually, if you look in as much as there is any kind of Indian scholarship on China, it's almost all produced by people from Eastern India. Yeah. From Assam, from Indians. It's a very striking thing. I mean that, in fact, almost all specialists on China are from Eastern India, and a couple from Gujarat. Again, because of that long tradition. And let's face it, I think it's this, Indian policymaking, Indian thinking, and so on, is so much dominated by the Hindi-speaking heartland. Yeah. And I think they have those same kinds of visceral responses towards China as they have towards Northeast India. So not to put too fine a point on it, I think there is a certain kind of racism almost.
I think that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is the legacy of colonialism, and you're always looking west.
Yeah.
So, of course, we don't even look, to further east, to Java and, Cambodia and places like that. But in China, were the Chinese as magisterially indifferent? Have they been to India?
India doesn't loom very large in their worldview. Yeah. It really doesn't. In one sense, it doesn't. But in another sense, everywhere you go in China, India is omnipresent. Simply because of the Buddhist connection. I mean, any temple you go to will have the Bodhidharma. Outside the most important image that you walk past is the Bodhidharma, who was a Tamil. And every temple will have a frieze of the sacred books coming across the Himalaya. So everywhere you look, actually, there are these references. I mean, created, I suppose, most of all by the Buddhist connection. But they have, I would say, in the contemporary world now, in as much as India relates to China, it's through a sort of international relation, strategic studies kind of discourse. Right. And I think the same is true at that end, But it's a curious thing. I mean, it's not, I went to the Shanghai book fair when, my Ibis trilogy was coming out. And I can tell you, I was just overwhelmed by literally the affection that people showed. They would come with their children, put their children in my lap, and the line stretched forever, the signing line. It was literally overwhelming. And wherever I've been in China, I've had just such interesting conversations with intellectuals, with university students and so on. It's been very, very interesting in that way,
So coming to your book, Amitav, one of the, as I said, it's multiple histories and around a certain plant. And you pay careful attention to all aspects of the business. So the conditions of cultivation, which you briefly mentioned, but we can talk about that later. Production, as also the factors distribution, consumption, and profit making. You speak of its use in pre-modern times. But then you write, and I'm quoting from your book, you write, the nexus between state power and trade, so characteristic of mercantilist Europe, slowly but surely turned opium into something it had never been before, namely an instrument of state policy. You of course explain that in much of your book, and in one of the latter chapters you suggest, based on studies by economic historians, that as much as 20% of the British Raj's revenues came from opium. And indirectly, you also say this doesn't account for the spin-off industries such as shipbuilding and transportation, which were also linked to opium. Now, can you expand on the role of the opium trade in the consolidation and perpetuation of imperial power? I mean, in your wonderful illustrated presentation, obviously, you focused more on its origins and its expansion, but in the consolidation and perpetuation of imperial power, including, of course, through warfare and inducement and coercion, some of the things you talked about in the book. So that's something I think maybe the audience will want to hear about.
Opium was absolutely fundamental, not just to the British Empire, but also the opium trade as an instrument of state policy was really pioneered by the Dutch. Actually, the weird thing is that conditions of trade in the Indian Ocean were much, much freer than they were in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, these monopolies were very common. So one of the reasons why the Portuguese and Spanish and so on set off to look for the Spice Islands was simply in order to break the Venetian monopoly on the spice trade. In the same way, the Venetians, in cooperation with the Fatimids and so on in Egypt, established this very lucrative trade monopoly on spices. So they set off, to break that monopoly. But from the start, the Dutch, the Portuguese, everybody, they saw themselves as merchants, but also as soldiers, as servants of the state. So the day they arrive, literally at the Spice Islands, wherever they went, they are in search of monopolies. They want to impose these monopolies. And the Dutch, in fact, in the Banda Islands, which produce nutmeg, they eventually just killed off the entire population in order to establish this monopoly. But the Dutch also discovered that they could gain favors amongst there was many small states in the East Indies. So they started trading opium to them, And opium thereby caught on in the courts of the small kingdoms of the East Indies. Then the Dutch started using that same tactic in the Malabar. They started using that tactic in the Malabar, and this is the weird thing about opium, that once a supply is provided, it takes off on its own, and that's the sense in which it's a maker of history. So opium became very popular in Malabar, and they tried to use opium to establish a monopoly on pepper, but never succeeded. By the mid-18th century, there was a very clear policy established by European states of using opium basically to just, how shall I say, to addict, a lot of people. And so Southeast Asia had that, and then from Southeast Asia. So the British adopted the same policy in relation to China. But every single major colonial power basically was able to sustain itself because of the opium trade. The French did this in Indochina. This is the strange part of it. Their argument always was that Asiatics, because of their racial proclivities, are prone to degeneracy and depravity, In fact, every Asian state that could resisted opium, bitterly resisted it. So even the Konbaung dynasty in Burma resisted it. The dynasties in Siam resisted it. Everyone tried to, but the Dutch and then the English just forced them, destroyed their armies and said, if you don't keep your ports open to opium, we are just going to defeat you militarily. So there was a string of small opium wars fought across the East Indies, and ultimately it culminated in the biggest opium war, which was that of 1839 to 41 in China.
You have an interesting discussion of claims, somewhat tendentious claims made by the British state in India, that pre-British states enjoyed a monopoly over opium. And I was reminded of the history of forestry, because when the forest department, by the way, is the biggest landlord in India. It controls 23% of the land. And when the British took over all these forests, they used a similar precedent, that the Mauryas had elephant forests, Tipu had a monopoly over sandalwood. But actually, that was not true. Most of the state, and when this argument was disputed by a dissenting colonial official who pointed out that large tracts of land, in fact, the majority of woodland was under the control of Adivasi and peasant communities, a British forest officer called C.F. Emery, incidentally the father of Leo Emery, who later became Secretary of State, disputed this and rejected it in a major conference in Shimla, where he said, the right of conquest is the strongest of all rights. It is a right against which there is no appeal.
Which is true enough.
Which is true enough, right. So your book, what are the parallels in your book, which maybe you'd like to elaborate on? You talk about the history of slavery and slave trade. And you say, I quote, like opium, in the case of slavery, the Europeans took a pre-existing small-scale practice and expanded it by orders of magnitude. Namely, they didn't invent it, but they really used it to far more deadly effect. And maybe there's a whole book to be waiting to be written comparing slavery and opium.
That connection occurs constantly in the literature. And I rather self-consciously avoid it. This is the only occasion in which I've touched upon it. Because I think, slavery, the suffering is so direct and so, it's kind of, yeah. I think one should make categorical differences, But in relation to slavery, a new book has just come out. It's a very interesting book on slavery. It's by a Mozambican scholar in England. And he, using 17th and 18th century documents, actually shows that, slavery was not a pre-existing practice in sub-Saharan Africa. What happened is that slavery has a very long history in the Mediterranean. Of course, bondage of various kinds has a long history everywhere. But chattel slavery has a very long history in the Mediterranean. Greece, Athens was 2/3 slaves. Yeah. Sparta was even more. And so on. They had these slave systems of production. Whereas in India, we had bonded labor and so on, but not really slave labor production. So it was the same in Africa. They had various forms of kinship where in in internecine conflict, if people were captured, they were incorporated into different lineages. This is not even really comparable to chattel slavery.
Yeah.
So it's really the Portuguese, again, who invent this whole thing when they start the sugarcane plantations in the Canaries. They need enslaved labor in order to make this model work. So they force a whole string of kingdoms in West Africa to start selling. They trap them in debt, and then they make them pay off the debt by handing over personnel. But again, with the whole story of slavery, one of the interesting things is that the whole story of abolition is presented as solely a sort of a gift from the great white master.
Man's guilt. White man's
That's
guilt.
right. Yeah. Whereas nothing of the kind. I mean, black people resisted for centuries and even presented arguments.
Yeah.
So this book that I was talking about, he's based his arguments on a 17th century African prince who goes to Rome and tries to work for the abolition of slavery.
So, return to your book and comparisons within your book. Your book throws a lot of light on the comparative histories of the two great Indian cities, Kolkata and Mumbai. You show how, which you again in your slides you only briefly mentioned, how opium cultivation in the east started under colonial auspices. In the west, more autonomous peasants, had a greater say. The opium traders in Kolkata were largely British, in Mumbai, substantially Indian. And of course, you also talk about Madras and the fact that Madras never had an opium kind of trade, so maybe languished economically and politically compared to Kolkata and Mumbai. But then you say this difference in how opium was cultivated and, of course, marketed and profited from, you suggest this helps explain Kolkata's later economic decline as opposed to Mumbai's enduring commercial viability. And I found that most interesting, so maybe you'd like to elaborate on that.
Opium production in eastern India was completely controlled by the East India Company. And this was a very draconian regime. This opium department actually employed armies of spies, of barkandazes, various kinds of enforcers. I mean, they literally had a paramilitary force which enforced the rules of the opium department. So there was a huge structure of surveillance. All the income that was generated in this region went straight back into these systems of surveillance and enforcement. What you had in Eastern India is in a way comparable to what is now called the resource curse. So we speak of the resource curse in relation to, let's say, silver mines or gold mines. But with a silver mine or a gold mine, you can check the people who are going into work in the mine as they go in and as they come out, and you can surveil them in that way. And in any case, a gold mine lasts maybe 100 years or something, or a silver mine similarly. But what you have happening in Purvanchal is that they are producing this incredibly valuable article on the fields, so renewably, So basically, every single person who's working in that district has to be under constant surveillance. Anyone who walks past an opium field has to be surveilled, And in some parts, this system still exists. And these peasants are producing opium well below cost. Can you imagine? I mean, this is the most valuable commodity that British India produces by weight. And it's produced below cost by these impoverished peasants who have to continue producing opium even in seasons when there's outbreaks of famine. And massive outbreaks of famine start in the late 18th century when the British start converting a lot of agricultural land to opium. So this is it's a very destructive model, social model, and there's a reason why the War of 1857 breaks out in exactly this region, and the first institutions that are targeted are actually the opium institutions. In Western India, it's produced in a completely different way. The British didn't actually they thought they could maintain the monopoly over opium production in Eastern India. But of course, people find out. And that there had always been a little bit of opium produced in Malwa as well. And when they see the British minting money from opium, they also decide to start planting opium over there. Now, the difference between the two regions is political, because the Maratha states put up very stiff resistance against the British, especially the Sindhyas, and fight the British literally to a standstill. In fact, they inflict major defeats on them in the late 18th century. It's not till 1803, and the critical date in Indian history, if you ask me, is 1803 and the Battle of Assaye, where the British, and in fact the greatest military genius of his time, the Duke of Wellington, inflicts a resounding defeat on the Sindhyas. And to the end of his life, when the Duke of Wellington was asked what was his most important battle, he didn't say Waterloo. He said it was Assaye. It was the closest thing that he had ever fought. So, but even after this defeat, the Marathas continued to be very strong. The Sindhyas had very large armies. So the British couldn't just tell them what to do. They had to negotiate with them. And so there was, of course, the Sindhyas, but also the Holkars and many other minor principalities. So these principalities were able to provide cover to the mercantile networks of the region, which thereafter began to ship opium to China on a very large scale through Bombay. The British also profited from this trade because they started taxing opium that was going through Bombay. But it took them a long time to shut down the smuggling routes. In fact, they invaded Sindh. The reason they really invaded Sindh was because a lot of opium was going through Karachi, but they wanted to profit from it, solely in Bombay. So Bombay, at one point, had almost been abandoned by the British because it was a very expensive station to maintain. But once the opium trade started on a large scale, that became Bombay's lifeline. And Bombay was literally kept afloat by opium. So, but Bombay, because of this history, the British were not able to establish a complete dominance over Bombay. In Bombay, the mercantile networks, because they had access to a hinterland of opium, the foreign traders were always dependent on them. So, for example, all the big Gujarati networks, it's a myth that it was only the Parsis. The Parsis were a fraction of the trade. The most important traders were, there were lots of Maharashtrians, there were lots of Gujarati Hindus, there were lots of Sindhi Hindus also involved, in the trade. The only difference with the Parsis is the Parsis actually traveled to Canton, to Guangzhou with opium, which most other Indian communities didn't, probably because of caste restrictions or something like that.
You have some interesting paragraphs on the Parsi presence in Guangzhou. Yeah. Your book, Amitav, is a sharp indictment of colonial rule and of colonial hypocrisy too. And you write, I quote, "No matter how genteel their manners, no matter how earnest their religious fervor, the British and American traders in Guangzhou belonged to an Anglo-American elite that had made a fine art of spouting pieties of various kinds while inflicting immeasurable harm on people around the world." Now, this is eloquently put, and I entirely agree that Western colonialism was hypocritical and self-serving, apart from exercising political domination and economic exploitation. But isn't this kind of hypocrisy true of all cultural and political elites? I mean, you think of having Brahmins down the ages, and some even today, and particularly in the last decade or so, begun to spout pieties from the Vedas and the Upanishads while treating Dalits and women as subhuman. That we may agree on, but even more perhaps pertinently, what about Stalinist commissars and their preaching of equality and their practice of oppression? I mean, isn't this, in a sense, common to all elites? They are self-serving, hypocritical, and attach an ideological, a sophisticated ideological veneer to justify their methods of exploitation.
Look, obviously, inequalities of all kinds have always existed. And, the issue of hypocrisy arises when you're talking about whether you believe, the justifications of those forms of inequality. And it's perfectly possible that in the Middle Ages, in Britain, I mean, in Europe, as in India, people believed that there was a natural sort of inequality. I mean, they had the great chain of being, which was very simple, similar to ideologies of inequality elsewhere. I think what actually happens in the 18th and 19th centuries, in the wake of the European Enlightenment, is that a new kind of thinking emerges, where abstractions of various kinds are invented to, as it were, remove human agency, if you like. So, for example, Europeans, even as they're killing, literally, they're instrumental in the extermination of countless millions of Native Americans, they constantly blame this on what they call nature. They say nature has natural laws. So they are dying because of natural laws in relation to pathogens or whatever, or also in relation to their racial composition, which is weak and so on. But this completely ignores the fact that they're actually mobilizing and instrumentalizing various kinds of non-human forces. These non-human forces include pathogens, they include livestock, which immediately begin to destroy Native American.
Alfred Crosby's book, Ecological Imperialism.
That's right.
It talks about
absolutely. So, they completely weaponize all these non-human forces, which begin to inflict this damage. But they absolve themselves and they say, we are not responsible, it's nature. Similarly to climate denial right now. They say, oh, we're not responsible, it's nature. Nature is doing this. So similarly, what happens in the late 18th century onwards is basically you have the Scottish Enlightenment, you have Adam Smith coming up with these ideas of the market, and then you have this idea of free trade, so the idea of free trade is simply that there is supply and then there's demand, and the market creates a balance between the two. So the way in which these British traders, and no doubt Parsi traders and others, also justify what they're doing to themselves is by saying there is a demand, and if we did not meet this demand with our supply, someone else would, But, this is the really bizarre thing, because what this mode of thinking really does is that it removes all the ethical constraints that historically people placed on trade. And these ethical constraints existed everywhere. They existed in China, they existed in India, they existed everywhere. Because actually capitalism, various forms of enterprise have also always existed, So the real innovation of this idea, of this ideology of free trade, is to destroy the notion that there should be any kind of ethical constraint. And this is what Lin Zheju says repeatedly to the British, that don't you realize that by doing this, you are actually dooming your own people eventually, which has come to be true now. So, this is the weird thing. They're talking about supply and demand as it were, pre-existing supply, while they're dealing with a substance that actually completely contradicts this law. With opium, supply creates demand. It's not that demand creates supply, it's the other way around. So, for example, the Sackler family in America, when they started marketing OxyContin, there was no demand for OxyContin, for these opioids. Within 2 or 3 years, through canny marketing, but most of all by making supplies of opiates widely available, they created this phenomenal demand. So that within 12 years, you have this incredible opioid crisis, so that today, opioids are the leading cause of death in America. More than 700 people dying every day. In a 4-year period, opioids killed more people in America than the Second World War did.
So I have a couple of things I'd like to ask you. One is about your intellectual trajectory, more broadly. It is to do with your lifelong interest in science and the non-human world. Neither of us studied science after school. I come from a family of scientists. I don't know whether you do. But
I come from a family of animists.
Animists, okay. But which makes your lifelong interest in science and the lifelong professional interest, post-university interest, so striking. I mean, it's very unusual for an Indian anthropologist or writer. You know the divide in our universities between arts and sciences and so on and so forth. But if I look at, the arc of your work, I mean, you've written, in your novels, you've touched on pseudosciences too, like phrenology, but real visible issues such as malaria and attempts to control it, plants, climate, as manifest in your recent work. Now, where did this come from? The only time I have actually, in all the stuff that I've done, remotely connected to the world of science and of the non-human world, is when I wrote on forests. And that was partly because the work was done in collaboration with the scientist Madhav Gadgil. I mean, it didn't really come from within me. But your work has, different kinds of manifestations. So I was wondering, is it Bengali science writing? Is it your early mentor JPS Oberoi, a sociologist interested in science? I just thought, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think you're being too modest, Ram. I mean, you pioneered environmental history in India. Your early work on environmental history remains to this day a benchmark for so many of us, and so many of us have learned from it. Your work on Chipko you didn't do with Madhav Gadgil, you did it on your own. So you completely pioneered that. And I think it's interesting that both of us have had these interests evolving, though from different directions. But it's probably because I sometimes think about it, and I think it may have had something to do with the nature of our schooling, where we were constantly exposed, to the mountains and the forests and so on. I certainly think that has something to do with it. But for me, certainly, as I said, I think you came to it through science, and I came to it through animism, if you like.
One last question. Your book is, among other things, about a great power rivalry. I mean, India is one part of it, but a great power rivalry between China and Great Britain. You talk about these two great civilizations at either end of the Eurasian landmass. So it's about a great power rivalry between China and Great Britain, with India and Indians directly and perhaps indirectly, maybe more indirectly and inadvertently aiding the latter, that is Britain, in this great power rivalry. We now live in a world dominated by the China-America rivalry. What might be India's role in shaping its future contours? Should it ally with either or both or neither? Are we in danger of being a kind of caught and having to take sides as we were in the 18th and 19th centuries?
The rivalry really isn't just between Great Britain and China. It's between the Anglosphere and because the Americans acted.
That's true. You do have a couple of very interesting chapters on the Boston Brahmins and so on.
Yeah.
But today, so let's look at today. I mean, you know all three countries very well. I mean, you're Indian. You lived for many years in America, and of course now you've spent the last decade and a half in many ways writing about China.
I wouldn't claim to be an expert on China or a historian of China or anything like that, but it's perfectly clear to me, what became perfectly clear to me, that this fundamental dynamic of contestation and competition between China and the Anglosphere has been basically the fundamental driver of modernity. And, now, again, we are seeing it in full-fledged form. I mean, China's enormous decline had a lot to do with opium and the opium trade. But, they are also the only country that has ever successfully combated mass addiction. I don't think that history is ever going to be repeated anywhere else. And it's a very striking thing today that when you look at what's happening in America, to an uncanny degree, it really mirrors what happened in China in the 19th century. There's a kind of civilizational shock, mass addiction, and so on. So, where will this lead? I think we are seeing an enormous geopolitical upheaval as we speak, across the Eurasian landmass. The West has, that is to say, Europeans have been dominant in the world for 4 centuries, and we suddenly see, a new world order emerging. What awaits us at the other end we can't say, but this is a time of extreme geopolitical instability. And, along with, there have been periods of geopolitical instability in the world in the past, but this time it's happening in conjunction with multiple other crises, biodiversity loss, climate change, mass migrations, political instability of various kinds. I mean, who would have thought even 10 years ago that a country so stable as Britain would so rapidly begin eviscerating itself? Yeah. So I think it's up for grabs. I don't think the world has ever been as unstable as it is today. I don't think, it's a hard thing to say, but I don't think we've ever confronted a future as dark as this.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.